Let's do this to start with, because I can't see in the back. If you are currently developing applications with React, just give me a clap. Yep, no, that's perfect because I can hear you even though the lights are blinding me. What about Angular? Got a couple. Vue, Svelte. We could play trivia frameworks that I remember from 15 years ago. Backbone, Ember, jQuery. Yeah. I guess Sarah brings up a good point. How many are developing applications with the WASM technology like Blazor? One. So I have spent quite a bit of my career developing web applications on different platforms. I think a lot of them have a valuable problem they're trying to solve. The one that I'm fascinated by right now is HTMX, and we're going to look at why that is today. So let's start by talking about the philosophy of what HTMX is trying to do. And this is the pull quote right from the HTMX homepage. HTMX gives you access to AJAX, CSS transitions, WebSockets, server-sent events directly in HTML using attributes, so you can build modern user interfaces with the simplicity and power of hypertext. And it's really that simplicity piece that is maybe the key to the whole thing. There are some really powerful things that our modern frameworks can do, but that comes with overhead. And that's not necessarily bad when you need it, but the web at its core is designed to be a very simple thing. And you can see here that HTMX wants to embrace the power of hypertext, which hypertext is one of those things that that's a term we know, we think about it, but maybe we haven't really thought about what it was in a while. But the inventor of HTMX is really big on these core ideas of hypermedia and hypertext. So according to Wikipedia, hypermedia is a type of multimedia that features interactive elements such as hypertext, buttons, interactive images, and videos, allowing users to navigate and engage with content in a nonlinear manner. And that sounds like the internet, because that's kind of how it is. When this idea was coined, that was fairly novel. In the 70s and into the 80s, when we were still mostly using print media, the idea that you would have documents that link to other documents, or documents that contain videos that you can play, that was still kind of a novel concept. And so a lot of the ideas of the early web were these interactive documents, these hypertext documents, from which we get the hypertext markup language, or the hypertext transfer protocol. And so HTML, HTTP, very core to what the web does. If we embrace those ideas instead of trying to work around them, what can we do and what kind of simplicity can we get? All right, let's look at how HTMX compares to some of the other modern frameworks. And I've got the caveat on here already. I thought about this a lot. These are very oversimplified diagrams. You could spend days talking about all these other frameworks. We're just going to kind of highlight some of the high points and see how HTMX fits in. So early in the web, there was really just this idea of a web page, an HTML document. When Tim Berners-Lee first started creating the web, that was his idea. And then pretty soon after that, we have this idea that web servers are going to serve up the document. And then pretty soon after that, it's like, okay, well, we're going to generate these documents programmatically from a database. And then not too long after that, CSS was invented. And then there was a Lisp variant that was injected into Netscape Navigator that we came to know as JavaScript, and all the beauties and the pains that are JavaScript were kind of YOLO'd into our lives without nearly enough thought. Yeah, like when you YOLO something into production, you only live once, man. You only live once. Take that scripting language and make everyone in the world write it. Never mind that we only gave you one number format and it's not the right one. I appreciate that people are laughing at that. Sometimes I make fun of JavaScript and people are like, JavaScript is great. It's fine. It's just, it could be better. And then we got to this idea where now these documents are now interacting with the server on a regular basis, and they're making calls, and web pages got big, and the JavaScript got big. And when things get big in computer science, what do? We create abstractions. And so we came up with ways to organize our JavaScript. And the JavaScript was making HTTP calls back to the server. And in general, the server was returning JSON. To skip over some of the early frameworks on the web, we get to maybe the first really big one, which is Angular. And Angular looks at this problem of we've got a lot of JavaScript, how do we organize it? And it solves this problem with using an MV star architecture, model view controller, model view view model, depending on how you think about it. And we're going to introduce components. And we have this way to kind of break up all the things that we're trying to do and have individual components that that have a single responsibility. But at some point it gets so complicated that we have to start introducing other tools. We have CLI tools just to manage our Angular applications. And that's not to say that Angular is bad. It's just complicated. React took a different approach and said, hey, this whole JavaScript and HTML thing, those aren't really two separate things. That's really more one idea. We're going to mash them together, and we'll manage it with JSX. And we also have components to make things a little more reusable, a little more isolated. And, of course, we need our own CLI tool. And that's not even to start to talk about all the things that we can do if we want to pre-render some pages and server render and so many things. React is incredibly powerful, but if we want to do something simpler, there's a lot of setup. So HTMX comes along and takes a very different approach, where all of the other single-page application frameworks leaned into the JavaScript side. HTMX is like, what if we went back to that whole hypertext thing that we're all built on anyway? What if we minimize what we're doing with JavaScript and maximize the HTML bits? And oh, by the way, that web server that's been returning JSON all this time, we want that to return HTML now. So this idea leads to what I think is one of the first key ideas in HTMX. And that is, if you're going to have an HTMX front end, your back end needs to, for lack of a better term, needs to be an HTMX backend. If you want to reuse APIs that you have in existence that just have JSON, it's going to be a world of hurt. You're going to want different APIs that return HTML. We're going to take this model that a lot of the other SPA frameworks use, where the web page has a lot of responsibilities and can render HTML based on the JSON it receives from the server. And we're going to move that responsibility over to the server and say that the server is now going to render the HTML and it's just going to send that back to the web page. This means the web page can be much smaller and much simpler. Now, because of a lot of the pre-rendering that we're seeing in our modern JavaScript frameworks, the web servers generally have good tools to render HTML. We just don't often think about it that way. And we follow this model, we can have simple front ends, simple HTML documents, and the web server does a lot of the work. I work at Sweetwater. Any Sweetwater customers in here? Yeah. Sweetwater is the largest retailer of musical instruments and pro audio in North America. And so we have enough web traffic that some of our analytics that need to be near real time, they need to happen really quick. And so we use Go for a lot of the high performance things that we do. And we're using HTMX to generate front ends for some of our Go services. And there is a library that we're using quite a bit called Temple, T-E-M-P-L, that allows us to generate HTML really seamlessly right in our Go code. And so our web server, which is written in Go, serves up the HTML. The HTMX makes the AJAX calls back to the web server. The web server does its analytics, renders the HTML, sends that back to the browser. A lot of the other languages have similar things. C# has the Razor engine that it can use to generate HTML. Yeah, I'm not as familiar with the other ones. I know that they exist for all the major platforms. All right, I was going to do a larger demo here, but because my laptop is currently turned off, I apologize. This will be much less interactive than I was hoping it would be. But here we see the code for an HTML page that can make a very simple AJAX request. And the thing that you should note is the distinct lack of JavaScript that you will see here. What you will see is in the markup for the button on lines 9, 10, 11, and 12 are these HX attributes. And those HX attributes come from the HTMX library, and they dictate the behavior. So this is a very declarative language. We're not writing the code to make the AJAX request. We're simply telling the button what it should do. Now, I will say, I keep downplaying the role of JavaScript. Obviously, there's JavaScript behind the scenes. You can see on line 6 of this example that we're pulling down the HTMX JavaScript script. Carson Gross, who is the author, maintainer of HTMX, has said a couple of times, I wrote JavaScript so you don't have to. And so you can see that here. We're loading in the JavaScript file, and after that, we have the ability to make some simple requests. So let's walk through this a little bit. What would happen if I could demo it for you? There's a button, and when we click it, it will trigger an HX get, which is just HTMX's way of doing a GET request back to the server. In this case, the request is going back to the origin server, so we don't have to have the full prefix, but we're going to say we're going to get the weather forecast view. And when that comes back, then we're going to do a swap. So that HX swap is looking for, or excuse me, the HX swap is talking about what kind of replacement it's going to do when it gets the result back. In this case, it's going to replace the outer HTML. But what are we going to replace the outer HTML of? Well, that's the HX target. So in this case, the HX target is that results div. You can see on line 15, there's a div with the ID of results. And so when we click on this button, it will go get that request and then replace that div with whatever came back. If I had done a different HX swap, let's say I had done the inner HTML swap, it would just put whatever came back inside that div. Interestingly, if I didn't have a target, the default behavior of the default for HX target is the thing itself, which kind of makes some sense sometimes. You can click a button, and the button gets replaced with whatever comes back. Maybe you just have some more details, You want to click the Get Details button, and then once it's clicked, the Get Details button goes away, and you just have the results. Now, there's no rendering here, and so in this case, if my if my endpoint at weather forecast get weather forecast view, if it returned JSON, what would happen is I would just have JSON printed out on my web page, which for nerds like me, I'm like, sweet, let's do that. If we could replace more of the internet and more of like the do you accept cookies with just like the JSON that told me what's going on, I'd be happy with that, but I would be in the huge minority. Most people don't want to see more JSON. So this is the C# example of my service that works with my HTMX front end. So this is kind of like an extreme version of the back end for front end. There's been a big movement in the architecture industry recently where your API is really aligned up with whatever you've got on the front end. So you don't try and share a back end REST API between your web app and your mobile app. You have both. Well, this is that with the dial turned up one more, because now our back end very much knows that this is an HTMX front end and it needs to return valid HTML. So you can see in this case on line 39, we're going to get the weather forecast data and then get a string builder and then start building up a block of HTML. So we'll have a div with a UL, and then for each forecast, we'll have an LI that has the temperature, and then we'll close all those tags and we'll return it. And the screenshot that I should have taken, I forgot in my haste, was showing like the resulting HTML. But yeah, what would happen is that basically on line 15 would be replaced with that UL with all the LIs of the temperature, and so you'd have a nice, simple view of the HTML. Now, is this the most powerful thing in the world? No. Is it simple? Absolutely. If we were building a modern React app, and again, I'm not trying to dog on React, I'm just saying it does a lot and it requires a lot of configuration. We would have multiple configuration files that are twice as long as this is. And that comes with power, but sometimes you just want simplicity. Sometimes simplicity means speed, and so we want to crank through. And HTMX is just a nice little tool for that. Let's talk about some of the other HTMX tags that we have. I showed the example of the hxget. You can easily imagine what the sibling tags are: the post, put, patch, and delete. They all have very similar behaviors where we're going to have a URL, and if we're doing a post and we're in a form, it will automatically take all the values of the form and send that back to the server. I mentioned what the target and the swap attributes do, but the target and the swap are like the two key tags for what are we going to do once we get a response. Again, we're not writing JavaScript, we're just declaring where we want it to go. In this case, the value for hxswap is before end, so now we're not replacing. I think before I talked about outer HTML and inner HTML, we're just replacing a whole bunch of stuff. You can also just put this as the last thing before the HTML, or before the close of the tag. We do have some nice ways that we can control the events. In general, we want to trigger events on a click, but you could also maybe trigger a post, or in this case, a get, if someone control clicks an element. Like in this case, we're going to You could control-click a div and get something back. I don't know why you would, but in the long list of things you could do, but maybe you wouldn't want to. You could trigger an event on a mouse over. Haven't thought of a reason why you would want to do that, but it's a thing you could do. You do have other options for what you pass back to the server. So with the HXVals tag, we can, maybe there's something in the cookie or some other variable. Again, this is assuming that there is some JavaScript somewhere that we want to do. But we can use this HXVals, and then the JavaScript or the JS attribute there tells it that we're going to treat this as JavaScript, and it should be evaluated before it's sent back. This HX trigger is on key up, and so we could be posting something back to the server every time. So it looks like this would just post every time a key press happened, it would post that key press back to the web server. Yeah, question. Yeah. So I'm going to be completely honest. There's a couple ways you can do it, and I don't know which one I like. You could put it in the query string. You could pass it in the body. And then assuming that you're using ASP.NET as your backend, then you have all of the routing declarations where you can say, I'm taking this parameter from the body or from the query string. Yeah, in general, I would say that HTMX does a pretty good job of just saying, here's what the HTTP request already does and where can I put things in there. It is worth noting that HTMX adds something in the HTTP request body that says is HTMX is equal to true. I don't know. I haven't figured out where that is because in my mind, your API would be very HTMX specific, but I don't know. Maybe there's some people that try and share APIs between HTMX and non-HTMX. So if you get, all that to say is if you get a request from the HTMX library, it will tell you that it's from HTMX. Good question. All right. Let's talk about trade-offs, because I think whenever we talk about a library like this, I definitely don't want to come across as saying you shouldn't use all of your other things. I had a really good experience a year and a half ago delivering a project with Blazor, and I thought it worked really well. That was a case where we actually were doing a lot of calculations in the browser, and Blazor worked really well for that. And there are certainly things that we're doing at Sweetwater that are complex enough that we need to use React, and that actually gives us the power that we want. And there are times when I have been trying to do something in HTMX and was frustrated by what I couldn't do. I put the quote on here, the hand you hold is the hand that holds you down, which sounds like it's from something really deep. It's actually from an Everclear song. I appreciate it. You can tell when I was in high school that I when I think about philosophy, I'm thinking about Everclear. The song is actually Everything to Everyone. It's talking about the problems of this high school kid that is trying to be everything to everyone, and you can't. And so it's the same thing with software, where a framework can't be everything to everyone. React is really good at what it does, but it's not so good at being this simple framework if you just need to render some stuff on the screen. HTMX is really good when you have something really simple and you need to spin it up and you need to get it in production in a hurry, and you just don't need to worry about, maybe you don't want to spin up a build pipeline for a web application. It's kind of a novel idea. Well, with HTMX, you don't have to. But there are certain behaviors, like you get beyond the list of tags that HTMX supports, and you're like, okay, well, now what do I do? And then all of a sudden, you're writing a bunch of JavaScript to do things that maybe React or Vue or Svelte would do for you. In their excellent book, Fundamentals of Software Architecture, the authors, Ford and Richards, had this quote that said, "There are no right or wrong answers in architecture, only trade-offs." When you use a larger framework, you're getting a lot of power, but you're also asking you're going to take on the responsibility to maintain that build pipeline, and you're going to take on that responsibility to manage a lot of the cruft that comes with it. Sometimes that's good, sometimes not. HTMX, super simple, but it's also going to limit what you can do. So then the question becomes, which one should you choose? Should you choose one of the larger SPA frameworks? Should you use one of the new WASM frameworks? Well, right, what's the consultant's answer? Right, just choose the right one for you. Know what you need. If there's anything I hope you take away from this talk is that HTMX is a library that is out there that you can use in your projects really simply. Not a lot to learn. I knew when I submitted this talk that it was going to be tricky to fill 45 minutes, and then I lost my demo, and so I'm half an hour. Maybe just remember that you learned everything you need to know about HTMX in half an hour, and that was good enough. Any questions?
So, I guess one of the things that I've seen about HTMX that is different from other frameworks, a lot of those have been developed for projects at scale that a lot of other projects don't even come close to approximating, right? So you reach for a tool to solve a problem that you may never have, whereas something like HTMX may be exactly the sort of thing that you need to reach for, and then as maybe you outgrow it, then you reach for something else, right? That has much greater scale to it than HTMX does.
Yeah, so for those in the back that couldn't hear, the comment really was about what do you scale to, and how do the different frameworks scale in projects as. I do think there is a time to maybe do your MVP with HTMX because you could get it in production really quickly, and then as you outgrow it, then replace it. And you don't have that much sunk cost because it didn't take you very long to build it. So I do think there's a whole spectrum. One of the things that's interesting for us, I don't know if any of y'all use a low-code or a no-code tool. We also have Retool. We have a Retool license, so there's some really simple CRUD apps that we do with Retool. And so we've had this debate of like, when do you use a low-code tool and when do you use HTMX? And it's like the ivory tower debate on that is kind of interesting, but in practice it usually becomes pretty clear pretty quick about which one's going to work best. They both have their place. The interesting thing about scaling, and we've had some debates about this too, some of our larger applications, Sweetwater will do north of $1 million of e-commerce on any given day, and way more than that on Black Friday. And so we do have some interesting scaling problems, and how do we effectively use our CDN, and how do we effectively use caching? One of the cool things about HTMX is that in that case, like in terms of the web performance and requests per minute, it scales really well. You can take that HTML file and throw it out to your CDN, and you're good to go. Now your page load time is fantastic. Other questions? If there's questions in the back, you're just going to have to shout it out because I can't hear you, or I can't see you. Say that again. Like when we're trying to scale up to like a large number of page views per minute. I mean, on the back end, we're still doing a lot of things. Like our Redis cache is really large, and there's, we're still load balancing our servers to try and get that breadth. But one of the things that is really important for us, like that time to first page load, is really cool. I mean, we're still making HTML these requests back to the server. What the? Sorry, my Apple Watch just started playing music for some reason. It's really bizarre. I don't know that I'm like really adequately answering your question, but it is true that by putting the rendering on the server, we are increasing some server load. I guess it's not as big of a consideration because the kind of apps we're using it for are not like your big, heavy SPA framework. Like you can kind of think of your React and your Angular and your Svelte and your Vue apps as being thick client apps, and HTMX is more of a thin client model where you're just not going to put as much on the client. You're probably not doing as much on the back end as well. Yeah, next question. Yeah. So the question slash comment was, you're just returning pockets, or you're returning HTML snippets from the server, and that is what HTMX is perfect at. HTML islands. Yeah. The author of HTMX, this guy Carson Gross, he is a huge proponent of this idea that the server know more about the HTML and render it and send it off, because a lot of, in the same way that JSX kind of takes that idea that the data in its display are not two separate concerns, but actually one concern, but it handles that concern in the browser. HTMX has that same idea that the data in its display are a single concern, but we're going to render it on the server. One interesting side note about Carson Gross, he actually has 3 frameworks that all have this same idea. I knew that intercooler.js was a thing a decade ago. He was the author of that. Very similar idea where you're going to have a basically HTML attribute-driven framework to do AJAX requests. And then in an anecdote that is actually really funny, because HTMX, the entire code is super small. It's a very small JavaScript package, especially compared to the other modern frameworks. He looked at that and was like, you know what, this is still way too much. And he stripped it down to another library that he calls Fixie, because it barely has any moving parts. Like the Fixie, the kind of bike that doesn't have a gear shift, right? And so it looks kind of the same, but HTMX maybe has 40 tags. I think Fixie has 8 or something like that. It's really bare bones. Yeah, question in front.
One of the big differences too with this and other libraries is that the coupling that you get between your front end and your back end is much looser in that you're expecting, a full HTML partial that's going to come back, that's going to replace something. Your front end does not have to know, like it doesn't have to receive a certain shape of a JSON object or something or whatever for it to render properly, right? It just needs a valid HTML partial, because it's using this whole, what they call HADIOS, right?
Yeah.
Hypertext as the engine of application state, I think is what it all stands for or whatever. And so that loose coupling gives you a lot of freedom. Yes, your back end does have to be written to produce produce valid HTML partials, but it can send back anything that's valid HTML. It doesn't matter what it is. It can be, different every time, and it's still going to. So one of the examples that they always cite is like if you're in a banking app and you go in and you've got money in your account, you have the HTML that would come back would give you options to withdraw, to transfer, to deposit, whatever. But if your balance is zero, you don't get the options to transfer or withdraw. The only thing you have is the option to make a deposit. But that is determined by the server as a result of some state that your front end doesn't have to know about at all.
Right. So when we think about, I don't know if I would use the term loose coupling. It's an interesting choice, right? It means that if we're doing all of our rendering of the HTML on the server side, that it's now a concern that the web page doesn't have to deal with, right? So like in a spa view, all that rendering, the web page has to know how to do this thing. And I would even say that the logical extreme of this is GraphQL, which is where our web server does even less because our client specifies the query that it wants, right? And so the web server now, it's the backend server that becomes kind of dumb. And there's a time and a place, and people are developing applications in a good way that way. This is just, when you're thinking about what your application needs to do, you might be like, oh, this is just going to be a lot easier if I don't worry, if my front end is simple. Now, I will say I'll come back to you in a second. One of the things that is maybe difficult is that some applications can really successfully have one REST API that is consumed by a web page, is consumed by a mobile application, is maybe consumed by other REST APIs. And in that case, I think JSON is a much better medium. And so consuming that JSON endpoint from HTMX is really going to be an impedance mismatch for you. So using HTMX it is limiting in that it wouldn't work very well for native mobile applications maybe. But if that's not what you need, yeah, it could be good. What else? Yeah, where do you want the rendering? Yeah.
This is kind of brittle. In that, the brittle part is that JSON, right? And whether that's JSON or GraphQL or whatever that's coming back from that server, if that's not the shape that JavaScript that's on the rendering part of this web page is expecting, something, this mismatch there, then there's your, potential failure. Where if you just have your web server returning whatever that, valid HTML partial is, anything that's living between the body tags and is closed properly, it's going to render properly with HTML.
Yeah, so I think the change management, like you're talking about, is an interesting thing because if we have an app in production, we have a JavaScript spa front end, and then we're using maybe Flask as our back end. If we need to make a change, we kind of have to change both pieces and keep them in sync. With HTMX, we change the back end and the front end is fine. So, again, all trade-offs. Here's my whole goal today is to tell you what it could do. You know your business. You know your technical constraints. You're smart. Pick the right one. What? Oh. All right. If there are any further questions, I'll be hanging out a little bit after. If not, thank you for being an engaged audience. It's been fun, and enjoy the movie.